So good evening, everyone. My name is Kelly. I'm with Lakeland Agricultural Research Association. I'm really happy to have Kevin Elmy from Cover Crops Canada with us tonight to talk about cover crops and cows. There's never a better marriage than the two together. It's really exciting that he's actually going to be doing this live compared to when he used to live in Saskatchewan and we had to record it and then play it for you guys and then do live question and answer. But if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them down into the Q&A or the chat on the bottom, and we'll get through all the questions. And I know that there's usually lots at the end of it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for logging in tonight, and hopefully you find this to be beneficial. And we'll, as soon as I get the control of the screen, and away we go. There we go. Okay, so there we go. We got the nice starting screen. Okay, so soil health, cover cropping, and livestock integration. Basically, when we start talking about soil health and cover cropping, you know, the five main soil health principles that I work off of is, number one, having a living root of a plant in the vegetative stage for as many days as we can. That is by far the number one thing, whether we're a cash cropper or livestock person. That living root of a plant in the vegetative stage is so important. Number two, we want to reduce tillage. And when we reduce tillage, we want to maintain that soil armor that we have. Number three, we want to reduce the amount of synthetics we use. Number four, we want to increase the plant diversity that we have in that year and in our rotation. And number five, big surprise, livestock integration. And that may be the reason why we're here tonight. So when we start looking at how, you know, our soils, you know, they're a real dynamic ecosystem that we have underfoot. And the problem we have with it, trying to understand it, is we can't see what's going on. We can see the results of what's happening in the soil, the plant growth or lack of plant growth, how the water enters the soil, all of these different things. But this soil has been a hidden enigma for us. It's really tough to try to break down and fully understand how it's working. So when we look at today's system management systems are, it's not necessary to have these livestock integrated into our soils, because we can do a lot of different things. But when we start adding livestock into our management systems and having the access to livestock going across our land at some time in the rotation, it allows our soils to build and heal dramatically quicker than trying to just use plants by themselves. Because when we look at how our soils were developed over the centuries, it was built on having plants growing and livestock coming through at some time in their growth period. So it wasn't necessarily every year, but it was allowed to have the plant growth, return that plant growth back to the soil, whether it's been trampled or it has been trampled, or it's been eaten or it has been eaten, but feeding the soil. And so when we look, this is a soil pit from our farm in eastern Saskatchewan. And one of the things that we always want to do is, when we're out and we're digging holes out in the field, what we want to do is we want to look at that A horizon. And that A horizon is that black layer. So in the soils in the Saltquoots area, we have an A horizon, and it just jumps from a A horizon down to a C horizon. So there's no real B. And so when we look at that black layer, we never want to see it just as a straight line. When we see a straight line, that means we don't have roots going down deeper. So we want to have these tap roots going in that are pushing the black down into the soil. And when we do that, that's when we know and we're building soil and have the potential to build soil. So under our modern agriculture management systems, this is what our soils have the potential to turn into. So this is a picture of some soil that's just north of Saskatoon. And if you, anytime you see soil, you should never see flat surfaces. They should look like fried hamburger or chocolate cake. When you see these flat edges, and especially when they're going horizontally, can you imagine a root trying to get through this? And this is when I went to this field, and the person said they tried growing cover crops for 3 years, and they maybe saw 10 plants in those 3 years. And I said, well, okay, jumped in my truck and went out there, and I started jumping on the shovel. And when you, if you know how big I am, and if I'm jumping on the shovel, I'm having problems getting into the soil, you know, the soil is hard. So when we finally did find a spot, we were able to bring up this soil sample. This is what we saw. And that's when alarms going off in my head. This is the result of either over tillage, overgrazing, lack of plant diversity, definitely a reduction of soil microbes in the soil, both the bacteria and the fungi, and the loss of soil carbon and organic matter in these soils. This is the reason why it ends up this way. So how do we reverse it? So one of the things we can do using cover cropping will allow another opportunity for livestock impact on our soils. And we can do that through relay companion cover cropping. We can do some intercropping, a full season cover crop, a capture or post-harvest cover crop, or a short or a long-term perennial forage. Once again, depending on what your definition of cover cropping is, you know, we can make anything work. But this whole idea of having this a crop or a bunch of plants growing just for soil improvement is kind of the quick definition of cover cropping. So, you know, a lot of these things can overlap in by definition of other types of crop, like a forage stand. The neat thing about the livestock integration, if there's some straight grain farmers on the webinar tonight, you don't need to own the animals. We've been custom grazing animals on our farm since 2000, and I don't know how to manage day-to-day animals. I don't know. I don't want to get into the market. I don't need to get into calving. All of that stuff. I have a neighbor just down the road that's how he makes his living. He knows how to manage the animals day to day. For me, I'm an agronomist. I know how to grow stuff. So that this way we have, and it's weird from the standpoint of livestock producers. Rarely do they have too much feed. So they're always looking for having more feed, and or, you know, have these times of the year where they need to be resting their perennial forages. So this is where an opportunity as a grain farmer that, okay, so I put some investment into fence, maybe a watering system, but it gives them the opportunity to take a cash crop off, have a cover crop underneath it that's growing in the fall, and allow those animals to come over to graze. And the real fun part of it for me is I get paid for it. And never mind the fact that I'm getting the manure, I'm getting, you know, all these other benefits. So when we're looking at, you know, the compensation of, you know, how much money can I get, and you know, from the flip side of from the livestock producer, the question is, okay, so what is how many dollars do you get per acre? And that's going to be, you know, the compensation is going to be related back to how much work does each party have to do. So if the cattle guy was going to have to put in the fencing and watering and moving fence and all the other good stuff, well, the grain person's going to get paid less than if they were going to be doing some of, whether they had the infrastructure or doing some of the day-to-day work. So it's really good up front to say, okay, this is what I'm doing, this is what you need to do. And then once again, it has to be a win-win on the price. And if you come to a good relationship with someone, it all works. When we start into this, the biggest thing is for the landowner is to develop some goals, both short and long term. And definition of short and long term is going to be all relative back to the landowner. And one of the really neat things is if someone is thinking about getting into organic production, seed down some cover crops, and whether it's annuals, biennials, or short-term perennials, have that down in that transitional time frame. Do your custom grazing on those acres, and it's going to be a really great way to have those acres get eligible for organic production, because it's going to be building fertility, it's going to be controlling weeds. And in the big picture, the bottom point is it gives you time to build your fungal to bacteria ratio. And why that's so important is as our fungal to bacteria ratio increases, what's going to happen is your weeds like wild oats, cleavers, those early pioneering plants that we call weeds disappear. As we have more bacterial soils and the more tillage we do, the higher the bacteria counts are, the more nitrates we have, the more those weeds show up. So if we can start out with a high fungal to bacteria ratio and can manage the decline of that, we're going to get way better production organically. And if we aren't going to be being organic and you just want to be more holistic, you're still going to have way more production with way less inputs. So it's a really great opportunity to build soil and build soil health. So some of the options we have, so we can either go out and grow these crops and we can hay or silage it. The neat thing with this scenario is we can go in, we can harvest the plants, and whether they're weeds or they're the plants we want to grow, it's going to be harvesting all that plant material. So it's going to be really taking the pressure off of your weed set and your weed bank in your soils without having to do a bunch of tillage. The negative is going to be exporting a lot of nutrients. When people ask about, the carbon, if we're harvesting all this biomass, that means, all this carbon that we're going to be putting into the soil is going to be lost. And the research has shown that 80% of the carbon that's above ground is going to be lost in the next, 3 to 5 years through microbial action and rotting and gassing off. We need to have that soil armor still on, so we don't want to shave the ground, but all that carbon above the ground, we're going to lose. And when I was going through university, I was told the way we build organic matter is we grow lots of biomass, we turn that back into the soil, and bang, we have organic matter. In reality, what the research is showing now, the stable organic matter in the soil is built through root exudates, through soil microbes, and the root biomass. This is where we gain really stable organic matter in the soil. That's part of the reason why I said we want to have those tap roots pushing down to store that black deeper in the soil. That's part of my thought process. Now, one of the ways we can get away from all of the exporting of nutrients on those fields is we can take an early cut of hay and then have lots of regrowth so we can graze it in the fall. So it's a bit of a compromise between just silaging and haying. One of the things that you can do with those bales, so you can get the bales out there, so you're getting them off and you can store those bales, but by kicking the animals out there, number one, you're resting those perennial forages that need rest in August, September, October, where they shouldn't be grazed, they're cut. And those animals are out there, so the manure and all the urine is going to be out on those fields. And when we can start doing that, then once again, we're stimulating the bacteria and the fungi in the soil. We're getting more root exudates because we have this green plants growing out in the field. We're gaining on the soil health. One of the other options we can do is we can incorporate putting the bales, leaving those bales out on that field. So we still have the stored bales, but we can leave the bales out in that same field that we're going to be fall grazing on. So that this way we're saving on moving those bales, the freight, and it's going to be putting all that manure back on the soil. On the flip side, we have a field that we've been haying. We can move those bales over to the field that we've been silaging or baling on, and just moving the nutrients over to that field. So once again, lots of different options we can do. Grazing. So in the grazing, we have, we can rotationally graze it, we can continuous graze it, or we can do a stockpile graze. And that's that stockpile, we can either be aiming for fall, winter, or spring grazing. The continuous grazing tends to be the least effective for building soil. That's going to be the one where that picture where we have that really plated soil sample, that was the result of continuous grazing. What we need is to have those plants regenerate and have good top growth, because when you take more than 50% of the plant leaf, what happens is those roots stop growing for 2 to 3 weeks. Once we start grazing 75% of that plant, those roots are stopped growing for, potentially 6 to 8 weeks. We're really shocking those plants. So if we can just always do that light graze, take half, leave half, and we'll go through some of the numbers right away of why we want to do that. Unless we're dealing with a stockpile situation. So if you're dealing with live plants, graze half, leave half. Stockpiled, okay, now those plants are dead. If they're biennials, maybe we want to manage a little bit more. But the stockpile grazing, okay, we grow them, they die, you graze them off. You still want to, once again, keep that soil armor happening. So this way we're not keeping that soil too black, but then we can start utilizing more of that plant. So when we're managing our grazing, it's a real good way of managing fall residues of cropland. So that's a big positive. So if we're having lots of straw out in the field, kick the cows out there and they'll help clean that up, as long as they can balance their ration by having either a high protein source or something green, something to balance that the rumen. It's able to clean up some unseeded acres. So your sloughs, your fence lines, those areas where you're not getting any cash revenue out of cash cropping, well, great, kick the cows out there, they'll graze down the sloughs. That's a win. And in this scenario, it's a relatively low cost system for grazing. But the negative is it may be unevenly grazed unless you have, that back fence to, keep them in a very tight herd, so that they're grazing and moving across that field relatively uniform, so they're cleaning it up well. When we start looking at supplemental feed, so when we have, a stubble grazing scenario and we don't have a lot of green underneath it to balance that rumen, so maybe the protein's a little low, maybe we have to start looking at supplemental feed. So whether it's alfalfa bales to boost the protein, or the neat thing with animals is if you give the animals a choice. So if I always recommend when people are saying that the animals aren't grazing the cover crop well, I usually suggest them put out one straw bale and put out one alfalfa bale or high quality feed, high TDN. And the animals will balance their own ration if given a choice. So if you are grazing a high brassica blend and the animals are kind of eating, but loose manure and you're not seeing the gains, put the straw bale out there, they're going to go to it and they're going to balance that rumen for themselves, because that's the way they like to feel. So it's neat from that standpoint. So the supplemental feed, once again, as I talked about the bale and grazing, it allows you to import nutrients and carbon into that field. So if you have a field that is a little on the hard side, low organic matter, low nutrients, well, if you bring bales in, you're bringing in the nutrients and a little bit of carbon. The negative is you're going to be increasing your cost, but the positive is it's going to increase the number of days in the field. And I've seen some numbers from about 5 years ago, so they're dated already. But basically having a cow out on the field, 1 cow per day works out to about a value of 35 cents of nutrients of the manure and the urine going back onto the soil. So that was a neat number that I saw, but how relevant is that right now? I have no idea. I have to do the math on it. Manure. When we start looking at manure, these when we are, where does the benefit come from? And when it goes through the rumen acts exactly the way the soil does, and it's full of bacteria. There's no fungi or not much for fungi in there, but when those cow splats hit the ground, It's been digested. There's lots of bacteria. It's now has exposed to oxygen. Now those critters in that cow patty are going to be doing their thing and getting those nutrients back into that soil. Very nutrient dense. Once again, if you covered every square inch of an acre with cow patties, there's a lot of nutrients there. So once again, that's maybe a bit too much unless you have a system that makes it work. But when you look at the saprophytic microbes, so the fungi, they'll get in there, and the bottom of the cow patties, they'll maybe look a little fuzzy, and that's your fungi that are eating it from the bottom up. And that comes from the soil. So as I said, the rumen and the soil are very similar. You need to balance what you feed both. So when we are looking at the manure, that tells us how that rumen is functioning, and the same as the soil. So that when we're putting just straw back into that field, what happens to that soil? It gets quite hard. When we grow peas, that soil becomes very fluffy. And so that's almost equivalent to, too much fiber and you get hard manure, you get too little fiber and you get runny manure. It's the same as the soil. So this is when we're looking at, the feeding, both the soil and the rumen. It's very, very uniform, like very complementary. And so there's an actual app in, I think it was University of Wisconsin, that they have a cow patty analyzer. And so they'll take a picture of cow patty. And so what they want to see is a relatively round cow patty. And they kind of have those concentric circles, just like this one on the left. And the middle of it is going to be skinnier, or not as thick, it's going to be thinner than the outside. So it lands and it kind of waves out. So the one on the left, that means that animal was functioning, the rumen is functioning quite well. Whereas the one on the right, that was closer to spring, and it was actually bison that was grazing. And you can tell that most of the green stuff was gone. They're eating a lot of fiber, and the cow patty was starting to stack up in pyramid. So maybe a little bit too much fiber. They needed a little more green in the diet. But when March rolls around, not really a lot of options for them. But this is what's happening both in the livestock and in the soil. We want to kind of keep it in that happy medium in between the two. So when you're partnering with someone, make sure you're on the same page. Have that discussion. Make sure your responsibilities are set up before you get into the year. You may have to revisit things. 2 years ago, when we had a little bit of snow, I had to fire up the snowblower and I had to blow out the fence line. Otherwise, the bison were going to walk over this 5.5-foot fence. So I didn't have to phone the guy to say, okay, should I do it? I just saw it and said, okay, I have to keep the bison in. Went out, blew out the snow drifts, and that I just took that as a responsibility. And whereas if our well would have went dry or we would have had no snow, okay, so who is going to be hauling water, and at what cost? So just having that talk and responsibilities. What do the animals need? Being able to modify as you go. That makes it once again a win-win. Designing this cover crop. So first thing we need to do is have some goals. And part of the goals is, okay, so when do we need this, and how are we going to harvest it? Are we going to be silaging it or grazing it? Are we going to be grazing? Are we going to be cutting and then grazing? Are we going to be swath grazing, or are we going to stockpile grazing winter, spring, or fall? That's going to then dictate what species we're going to be using and putting into these mixes. So if we're going to be looking at hay and silage, we don't need to have a lot of regrowth. Whereas if we're grazing or cutting and grazing, we definitely want to have that regrowth happening so we have something to graze in the fall. If we're swath grazing, we want to have something that when we put it in the swath is going to hold its nutrition. Same as stockpiled. If it's stockpile grazing and we get a snow on it, we don't want it to just automatically flop to the ground and disappear so that the animals can't find it. So we want something that maybe a little more lignin that's going to stand up and present itself to be grazed. When we're talking about the different functional plant groups, so this is the plant diversity part, I talk about having, the three big main groups. So our grasses, our legumes, and our broadleaf. Because the broadleaf, by definition, it's not a grass or a legume, I've broken that into three separate subgroups called the brassica, non-brassica, and forbs. The more of these species we have in the mix, the better off those animals are going to be. And we'll get into some of the strategies right away. This is a quick visualization. So if you go to covercrops.ca, that's the website that I put together for cover cropping. There's a cover crop assessment sheet. And so it goes through setting goals and things like that. And then this chart. And what we want to do is, as we're developing a blend, we can write down what species we're going to be putting. So if we're going to be using oats and Italian ryegrass, well, we can write those up near the grass. If we're using hairy vetch and sweet clover, well, put those down near the legume. So this way we can see how many of those boxes we can check. And then what we're able to do is also do a comparison. So within each group, we can put subgroups of warm season and cool season species. And between each and the warm and the cool season, we could talk about annuals, biennials, and perennials. And the reason why we want to have combinations, and once again, depending on what the goals are what your next crop is, a lot of those things will influence whether you want to go to biennials or perennials. But by having those, it really adds a lot of diversity onto it. So these are the things that I'm looking at. Then when we're looking also at this, I'm also thinking about, what are those roots doing? Are they a fibrous root system? Are they shallow? Are they a deep fibrous root system? Are they a taproot? Are they branching taproot? When do they grow? How do they grow? All of those different things putting in to develop a blend for people. So to go through and go through some examples. So when we're grazing, what we want to look at are plants that regrow after grazing. So using these late maturing species or biennials, this way it's going to stay in that vegetative state for a longer period of time. Ideally, when we're grazing, we want to be able to have these small paddocks and move these animals relatively regular. If we let them graze it too hard, it's going to affect the amount of regrowth we can get later. And so it means a little bit of work. If it means that you're too busy, you don't have time to move them, well, it's just going to affect the number of days of grazing you're going to be doing. And so when I talked about earlier about grazing half and leaving half, Jay Fuhr from the American Farms down at Bismarck, one of the things that he did is he went out and he, in his cover crops, he went out and he took each plant. So he ripped it off at the base and he balanced it on his finger. And when it balances on your finger, guess what? That's half. So he cut it off and he tested the top half of the plant of these different species and the bottom half of the plant. So when you're looking at the annual ryegrass, for instance, where the top half, your protein is twice as high, your relative feed value is about the same, your TDN is slightly better. But as you go through here, each time the top half is better than the bottom half. And when you think about it, where are all the problems for feed issues, so nitrates, high sulfates, high lignin, it's all in the bottom half of the plant. And so if we can leave that bottom half of the plant, we're going to see better gains in our animals and we're going to get more grass production. So when those animals are eating the top half of the plant, they're actually full. They're actually happy. They're content. And so this is where you move them on to the next. One of the really neat examples that we saw on, part of this is we were at a pasture walk a couple of years ago. And the person was doing a good job of rotational grazing, had the back fences, was moving animals every 5 days. And I went out there with my Brix meter and I saw the brome grass was, quite a bit taller than what the orchard grass was. And I went out and I grabbed the Brix meter. I started doing Brix tests and the orchard grass had almost twice the Brix. So the Brix is the sugar level. and it had twice the bricks of what the brome had. So the animals were selectively grazing for the orchard grass. So when I pointed that out to the owner, he said the next week he went out there with his fencer and he put in more posts. So he made his paddocks half the size, and he was moving his animals twice as fast. And he said it was a really nice management change. It really, it made him a lot more money doing that. So when we're looking at hay and silage, once again, the regrowth isn't as important unless you're doing the grazing after. For hay, you need it to dry down. So picking species that are not juicy are critical. The silage can be juicier, so you can have, juicier plants. But even then in silage, I should put the picture of the one guy. I'll just tell you a story. For the brassicas, I rarely go over half a pound, and maybe go up to a pound if someone really wants to push brassicas in a mix. And so I was working with this one dairy, and he said, yeah, okay, we'll put a little bit of collards in, silage them off. And he said, wow, those are really impressive. He wants to do, a pound and a half of brassicas. And I said, no. So we did up the blends, and when we were done, he said, yeah, throw in an extra bag of collards. And I said, I know what you're doing. Don't do it. He said, no, I got to prove it. He sent me pictures in the next winter, and he actually wrecked his grapple. Where he put the high brassicas, the silage froze absolutely solid, and you just couldn't feed it. So the juicy part is okay. You just have to make sure you dry it down. So if you need to dry down the hay, silage can be juicier. You still want that plant in the vegetative stage, even if not grazing. And this is either for hay or for cash cropping. And we want to have that vegetative plant about half to maybe maximum 2 plants per square foot of this vegetative plant underneath. And the reason why we want to do that is because when a plant is in the vegetative stage, it's going to release up to 80% of the carbon it captures through photosynthesis back into the soil to feed the soil biology. When the plant changes from vegetative to reproductive, the root exudates that go into the soil are more resilient to microbial breakdown. So it stops feeding the soil. So by having that vegetative plant, that is continuing to feed the soil biology. The biology is still be able to do what it needs to do for a longer period of time. You're going to see some dramatic increases in your water infiltration, your nutrient cycling. Just the whole system is going to work so much better. You're going to see less weeds in that field. Okay, so your stockpile grazing, stockpile forage. So we need to have species that are going to hold feed values after it freezes. Now, the question is how much snow do you get, and how hard is that snow going to crust over? Those are some of the concerns that you're going to have to look at. And then the other thing, as we get closer to the forest, what concern about wildlife damage you're going to have. And in this field that I had, people were asking to go deer hunting in it, and I said, okay, so you shoot a deer, how are you going to find it? They'll never find it because there was so much biomass out there. So that was my my green manure field that I didn't work in, but it was something where okay, so it fed the deer. Well, the positive for the cattle people in the area, they didn't have those deer eating their stuff. They were over at my place eating. So I was a sacrificial lamb on 80 acres for the livestock. So in a cash crop rotation, after having the livestock on the land, it does wonderful things to your nutrient cycles. So a beef cow on average will urinate about 10 gallons of urine per day. And then when you think about a beef cow also will eat about 2.5% of the body mass weight of forage. And most of that goes out the back end. So for a 1,200 pound cow, she'll eat about 30 pounds of dry matter. Most of that gets shot out the back as manure. And so once again, this is all adding to your soil and your soil fertility. Your soil health, when you start throwing these livestock out there, it's going to be improved because you're going to have that manure and urine. So it's one of the best descriptions that I had was Dr. Chris Nichols said, we are carbon-based creatures, so that when we eat any nutrition, it is always, minus water, it is always attached to a carbon molecule. So if we need nitrogen, if we need phosphate, and we need any of these nutrients, it is attached to a carbon molecule. And this is how we metabolize it. Same thing as a soil. We have a carbon-based ecosystem underneath our feet. Anytime we put a synthetic nitrogen or something into that soil, it has to get converted through the biology. And when it gets converted through the biology, it has to take that's basically salt and then attach it to a carbon molecule so the plants can properly utilize it. So when we have this manure and urine, it is nutrition linked with carbon. So then that system is actually going to work really well. When we have soil health and we have the cover crop and the livestock, we're going to be automatically reducing tillage. There's going to be some tillage in quotes with the hooves of the livestock. When you look at a cow hoof or bison or horse or whatever, sheep, those hooves, they will do some tillage on the surface. And when we start getting into mob grazing, you will see a fair amount of disturbance right at the surface. But when we see that soil profile and we're dealing with, 8, 12, 20, 24 inches of topsoil, and we are mob grazing and we're damaging the top inch, we've done some damage on the top, but we still have that rest of that A horizon that is very, very happy. So that's where we can get away with some reduced tillage. Now, if we go in and once again, I love the saying, it's not the cow, it's the how. If you go in and we're not doing it right, well, it's going to create more tillage, and so that's not a good thing. But the other option, having the livestock and cover crops, is it increases our plant diversity we have on that acre, that field, and it also gives us the opportunity to have that continuously vegetative plant. And when we start doing that, it really starts accelerating that soil health. And this is where I said when it's not the cow, it's the how. When, especially when we start talking about Northeast Alberta, where it has rained once or twice in the fall, when we're trying to graze, when that soil is saturated and wet, when we put animals out, or in this case, the haybine, whenever you do any pressure on soil that is either saturated or really high moisture, first thing that gets pushed out is air. So then it goes anaerobic. It creates some compaction issues. So then, how do you get around that? Well, you have to either wait till it dries or freezes, or, okay, so this cover crop that you have out there, that it's going to die, and you're going to do, you have to do maybe some tillage, or you're going to be seeding it next year. Well, you once again sacrifice that field. When you do sacrifice that field, remember that, and don't sacrifice it 2 years in a row, because that's when it will create problems. When we are looking at the soil nitrates, if you don't tie those up in the fall, so when you have the manure, when you have the urine, and the microbes are still active and they're growing and they're doing their thing, what'll happen is that nitrogen source in the soil through the manure and urine, it starts out as protein amino acids, and the microbes start using them, eating them, and dying and poop them out. And that nitrogen source slowly gets degraded down to nitrate. When you see nitrate in the soil, you're going to get a weed flush. If we can have that green plant, it intercepts that nitrogen and it keeps it in that amino acid or protein, some higher level of nitrogen containing compounds. And so it releases that back into the soil, and we have that low nitrate, that means we're going to have low weed pressure. The other really neat thing is when we have low nitrates in the plant, then we have less disease and less bugs. Really neat concept when we can control what stage that form of nitrogen is. And the other thing what we want to do is livestock integration is trying to match that plant supply with your animal nutritional needs. So that this way, if it's younger animals, you need a little protein. Well, let's try to match that up instead of trying to get these young animals or out of condition animals through the winter and just feeding them straw. So when we have this proper livestock integration, it builds soil. When we have improper management, it destroys soils. And this basically is overgrazing. When we have this livestock integration, it builds our nutrient levels in the soils. We've seen some incredible increases in the base saturation of calcium, the available phosphates, your nitrogen, your sulfur, just the whole system is just more balanced. This livestock integration also allows you to control some weeds. It allows you to manage some crop residues, increases your plant diversity, which increases your microbe diversity, and also creates, as a cash cropper, new opportunities for cash flow on the land. So that this field that you're looking at in the picture, if we were just cash cropping, we would grow our crop for 4 months, we would harvest it, and then for 8 months it would be not generating income for me. Whereas, okay, so we bring in some animals, we do some fall grazing on it. Well, now we can generate a few more dollars out of those acres. So as a shameless plug, I wrote a book a couple of years ago, like 2 years ago, cover cropping in Western Canada. I think Kelly, I don't know, did you Kelly had some copies of it up in the office. So if she doesn't have, I can get more up. Otherwise, just drop me a note and I can mail out a copy. Otherwise, you go through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and Friesen Press. So thank you for your attention, and we'll open up for discussion. I'll leave this on for a little bit. If anybody's trying to get a hold of me, Kelly has all my information too. You can go to covercrops.ca or imperialseed.com. All my information's there. So
Thank you so much, Kevin. Looking at your manure pictures brings me back to when I worked for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and we had to do poo counting essentially, and we were doing a high legume pasture mixes and stuff like that. So we had to go out and count how many poo patties there were, and then we had these little clear translucent sheets to like show how big they were splatting, and it's like, oh, kind of brings me back to a nightmare situation, I guess. But
he'd be screaming tonight.
I've been dreaming of that. So, it's fun.
It's a crappy job, but it has to be done.
Yep. If anybody has questions, we are a small enough group. I could unmute people if people want to ask their questions in person. Or there was one question that came in: what would be the best cover crop to introduce that you would produce hay, but also grazing options? Oops, I guess I should open it all the way up. What would be the best cover crop to introduce that would produce hay, but also grazing options for cattle and horses? The soil has been tilled, but left for the last 2 years to regenerate.
Okay, so this is where the goals really have to be asked: is, are you looking for an annual, a biennial? Are you looking at cash cropping along with it? What kind of soil fertility is there? Are you looking at continuous grazing through the summer, fall grazing, winter grazing? Because each one of those scenarios is going to give a different answer. So that if we're looking at producing hay, but then the grazing, if you're looking as an annual, and then so a perennial with fall grazing, so using things, and then how long of a stand do you want? So do you want a perennial for 4 years? Are you looking at a perennial for 10 years, or you're looking at a perennial for longer than that? Longer the better. So and then it's going to be the context of where are you. So if you're northeast Alberta, then meadow brome is kind of the king. Not the greatest for hay. It's good for hay for the first 3 years, and what happens is the fungal to bacteria ratio in the soil. The first few years, the fungal to bacteria ratio is relatively low, and as it starts increasing, the meadow brome changes from being reproductive, so where you get a nice tall stand out of it, to just being basal leaves. So first couple of years, meadow brome will work great for hay. After that, it declines. So to throw in some meadow brome, to throw in some tall fescue, some grazing species, some meadow fescue, and then have some intermediate wheatgrass, some timothy, some things like that, along with some alfalfa, maybe some Sicer milk vetch for a non-bloat component, maybe some sandfoin. So once again, a fair amount of diversity. When we start moving north to throw in warm season species of perennials, really tough, unless Kelly knows some magical one that'll compete with the cool seasons. But basically, we're going to be looking at these plant growths, and especially through their lifespan, the low ones that are going to be, tight to the ground, so we're not going to get much of a hay crop out of it. But the taller ones, like the intermediate wheatgrass and timothy, that will stick up, get a cut of hay. They're not going to regrow all that great, but all this other nice green stuff underneath. So you will need a blend. You'll be able to put something together so that you can, once again, check off the boxes that you still have something green in the fall. Hopefully that answered that question.
The next question is, any suggestions for invigorating native coulee pasture so it's sloped and hard to get machinery in that was previously overgrazed?
Yeah. Overgrazing, it's amazing how long it takes for those plants to recover from an overgraze. And you get into a year like this year, it was hard not to overgraze because with not a lot of rain, and with the animals are hungry, not enough food, what do you do? So we'll abuse a field once again, have to remember which one we abuse the worst so that we give it the more rest the next year. So when we're looking at these situations where we have tired pastures, and if you're interested, the Chinook Applied Research down at Oyen, they have that soil health lab, so you can grab soil samples, send it down there, and get a kind of a baseline. But from my experience, when we have these fields that are tired, and whether it's native or it's introduced species, doesn't matter. But once again, our fungal to bacterial ratio has gone fairly fungal. And the reason why we have high fungal to bacteria levels is because our bacteria is way down here. So our fungal could still be low, but we need to get our bacteria levels up. And the way we get the bacterial levels up is giving them simple sugars. So there's John Kemp wrote a book, Quality Agriculture, and there's a guy in there that gave a presentation on Tom Dykstra. He is a chapter on his philosophy. And what he recommends to his customers is, in areas that don't grow things well, go in there and put 1 pound of sugar per week per acre. Nice and simple. Talk to, who was that? I talked to too many people in a day. And they were talking about a rancher in Western Australia. He went out and he bought a bunch of no sulfur molasses, and he put it into a plane. He diluted it with water. He sprayed it on half of his ranch. And the next year, where he sprayed the molasses, he had really good production. Where he didn't, there wasn't as good. So guess what he did the next year, or that year? He went out and he got more molasses and put more on. So when we have these poor producing areas, by putting down a sugar, molasses, something like that, it's going to feed your bacteria. So once again, you're dealing with your bacteria down here, your fungi levels here. When you add a simple sugar that the bacteria can eat, what's going to happen is those bacteria populations can increase tenfold in 4 days. And that's the reason why you give a little bit. And so you give a little bit of sugar and it jumps up, and then it used all that sugar. So then you give it another shot, so it jumps up a little more. So we need to increase the amount of bacteria and the bacteria activity in those areas that are low producing. So, that sloped area, it's going to be a little tricky, because how do you get out there and spread sugar? But on the flip side, it's not going to be rocket science, whether you just broadcast, dry, or, once again, get a plane in to put on some, whether molasses or sugar, get that carbon back into the soil. And then the other thing you need to do is keep the animals off it for as long as you can, not years, but 6 months, 8 months, something like that, so that we're allowing the top growth to grow up. And when the top growth grows up, that means our roots can grow down. As soon as we keep that top short, we're keeping our root short. So it goes back to a little bit of management too, but steep slope, tough.
So there's another question. Any suggestions for trying to improve saline soils over the long term?
That's the other one, a bit of a hot topic the last couple of years. So when we're looking at salinity, what that is an indication of is in our soils, we have lots of sodium or magnesium, because we can have magnesium salts or sodium salts. And the quick way you can tell the difference of the two is that when we look at the soil, and if the plants aren't growing, but the soil still looks black, most likely it's a high sodium soil. When we look at the soil and it turns white, most likely that's a magnesium soil. Just a quick way to identify which one is which. Now, what does that mean? Nothing, because the way you tackle it is the same way. So we want to have tap roots to go down. We want it to fracture in that soil, because in those soils where it's saline, we have a hard pan. It's an induced hard pan, because once again, you do a soil test on it, our sodium's high, our magnesium is high. So that means you're dealing with really hard soil. High mag soils are hard. So, and your calcium is low. So what we want to do is have a taproot go down, fracture that soil open. So then we're going to be able to allow that either magnesium or sodium salts to leach down. We want to have calcium brought up from deep in the soil profile to be brought up into that top part of the soil. And when you increase the calcium in that soil, then it flocculates and it gets fluffy. The other thing we want to do is, because of when we have salinity, if anything's growing there, it's either kochia or it's foxtail barley. And both of those, there's a book that I recommend to read, is When Weeds Talk by J.L. McCammon. And I have to get a hold of that guy to see if he'll give me a royalty, because every presentation I bring it up. So in there, it gives you an indication of what conditions weeds want to grow in. And if we take the ecological advantage away from those weeds, they don't want to grow. So in this case, if we have foxtail barley growing, we open up that soil, we fractionate that soil, we have that taproot going down, we tie up the free nitrate in the soil, we leach down that sodium or that magnesium, and we bring up more calcium, the foxtail disappears. And then when I start showing up again, that means that those levels are starting to come back again, so we have to reevaluate. So when we are doing situations like that, what we want to do is use species like sweet clover. We can get into the tall fescues. We want to throw some chicory in. We want to throw in ideally some beets if we're on the Saskatchewan side. If we're in the Alberta side, you have to get permission from the Alberta sugar beet growers to grow beets. Maybe a little bit of turnips, radish. Those tuber crops are going to bring up lots of calcium. So that's going to help flocculate the soil. Those tap roots are going to create a pore, so it's going to go down. And then we can start getting away from having that saline area. What we need to do with all of that biomass, we have to keep that armor on, so that this way we take the E out of ET. So ET is evapotranspiration. And so we want to get evaporation out of it, because when that soil is here and it's bare, when the water comes up and it evaporates, it leaves the salts on the surface. If we have it covered, now we've reduced the amount of evaporation. Now those salts aren't being pushed up and left at the surface anymore. So we want to have that ground cover. So taking some old bales, shredding in those areas, having some of these tuber crops in, having some perennials in there that are deep rooted, then we have some solution to it. So and Jay Fuhr, he said, if an area is saline, you'll never ever fix it. It'll always be the potential of going back saline. So you have to manage it that way. So you could break it up, get a couple crops off, and then slap it back into a perennial for another period of time, break it up, couple crops, get it back. So we have to manage it that way. Good question.
So what are some of the best perennial species for using for stockpile grazing?
Stockpile grazing. And once again, it's going to be relative when we start talking about how much snow you get. So meadow brome is a real good grazing plant during the summer and going into the fall. But as soon as we get a snow on it, it could be nice and leafy and everything is up and the cows are able to graze it. But as soon as you get a snow on it, it goes flat on the ground. So what we want to use are species that have, a little stiffer leaf. They're going to stick through the snow a little bit better. And the other thing we want is leaf retention when we start talking about our legumes. So using things like tall fescue has been kind of a traditional fall grazing, stockpile grazing type of plant. We can use, meadow brome if in the first couple of years when it's a little stemmy, smooth brome, things like that, where it once again has an upper above ground part of the plant that is not going to be pushed under the snow as easily. When we look at the legumes, alfalfa, when it starts freezing, what happens to the leaves? They fall off. Whereas the sandfoins, the Sicer milkvetch, they work really well in a winter grazing scenario because it hangs onto the leaves. If we're looking at some annuals or biennials, hairy vetch, common vetch, really good ones for winter grazing. And so when you look at some of the other grasses, once again, depending on what stage they're at, is going to determine how well they graze in the fall. So, corn, for instance, especially seeded at really low seeding rates in cover crop mixes, they'll stand up. So if you have one per every 10 square feet, a nice draw for animals, that they see that corn, they'll be going to go for it. And as they're eating away at that, hopefully there's going to be other species around it in the snow that they're going to be able to get at.
What is the best for a turnaround crop after silaging soft white wheat for grazing due to not enough pasture?
Another real good question and very common in the last little while. And the neat thing with the grazing after silage. Okay, so number one, you have livestock, so that's a real good opportunity. And if you have livestock, what also is going to happen is you're going to have pasture. And one of the speakers that I've listened to a few times is Clayton Robbins out of Manitoba, Rivers, Manitoba, and he did his Nuffield scholarship on grazing. And one of the things that he found was, number one, the rumen works awesome if you can keep your water soluble carbohydrate to protein ratio at 2-to-1. And so that's one of the neat things. And the other thing that he found was, if you don't graze or cut your perennials in August, September, October, those perennials are going to be stronger long term. So, okay, now you're silaging. Now you have this opportunity to do some fall grazing out in those fields. So number one, you've taken nutrients off that field in the form of silage. But now we have the opportunity to have something growing underneath it so that we can go out and we can graze it and then, cycle those nutrients a little bit better. So the quick, easy thing that we've been recommending is Italian ryegrass, especially if you're going to be spraying it. If you're going to be spraying your wheat, you can spray it with whatever you're spraying your wheat with. Seed your Italian ryegrass at 2 to 3 pounds an acre. And you'll have lots of fall grazing. To add a legume component, if you put in some Persian clover is one of the few clovers that regrows after cutting. There's a legume component. And then if you were looking at adding, that next level, you'd maybe put in maybe a brassica. So whether it's something like kale, forage rape, or something like that. So, if you didn't want to have that in your silage, it's going to be lower growing. So you can cut your silage off, still have all that diversity underneath, and then it'll be taken off in the fall after you've taken the silage off. That's the easy button. If you wanted to go into the steps of taking the wheat off and then turning around and seeding again, well, then you have a few more options you can get into. But once again, it depends on what your goals are and and what your moisture is like. If it's dry in the fall, it's tough to get things established. If you have it established with your wheat in the spring, it's easy.
The next question is, they've heard hairy vetch has a poisonous component. Is there truth to that?
Hairy vetch and toxicity. Okay, so when you're looking at hairy vetch, and it is a high tannin plant, so animals at first not going to be too crazy about it, just because it has that bitterness to it, but once they get onto it, they do fine. Gabe Brown, he grazes pure stands of hairy vetch without any problems, and he grazes it during the summer. Where the problem has been in the past, and once again, does it happen a lot? No, but it's happened enough, and one time is enough. When the hairy vetch gets to full maturity and you have lots of seed on it in a monoculture stand, and the animals are out grazing and they get too much grain in their rumen, that's where the toxicity comes in. So there's something in the seed coat. Kelsey Beasley told me once, and I forgot the compound, but it's when you get full maturity and you're having lots of grain ingestion of hairy vetch. So do I tell people to grow monocultures anyways? No. So if you do have hairy vetch in there and you have 3 pounds an acre, which is one seed or one plant per square foot, even if it's at full maturity, it's not going to be a problem, because the animals are going to be eating other things. So once again, the solution to pollution is dilution. So if it's 9 plants per square foot, that's a problem. 1 plant per square foot, you may get some animals with a bellyache once in a while, but it's manageable.
Do you have any comments about or any benefits to buckwheat? We've had quite a few producers who have more interest in buckwheat, so I'm just curious as to the benefits of that.
Actually, on a week ago, I actually spoke at the Manitoba Buckwheat Growers annual meeting, so and went through the presentation of where buckwheat fits. So the buckwheat as a nutritional plant, it's okay. It's nothing that sets the world on fire. Animals don't go through fences, so they can go eat buckwheat. The claim to fame to buckwheat is that it's quick growing and it frees up phosphate in the soil. And that's absolutely true when, to loosen up that phosphate, because it has a very acidic root system. So it breaks that calcium phosphate bonds, the weak ones, and it does help circulate. And the nice thing with it is it germinates and establishes very quickly. So that's a positive. If you are a beekeeper, you're not going to be happy, because it's going to potentially contaminate your honey, because buckwheat honey is just a different class of honey. Anyways, I love it, but anyways, so when we're start looking at managing it, so if you put it into a blend, it's going to mature very quickly. So then we're going to have to manage, how we're going to be grazing it, how we're going to be cutting it, how mature do we want it. And the other thing in the fall, if you seed it in the fall, first frost, it's done. It has 0 frost tolerance. So, to put it into a blend, absolutely put it in, good diversity. To rely heavily on it, I'm not 100% sold on having a high buckwheat type of mix. There isn't too many animals that like grazing pure buckwheat, but to put it in the blend, absolutely. So yes, it increases your phosphate, but in my mind, you're going to get more benefit out of building mycorrhizae fungi to get your phosphate cycles flowing than to try relying on buckwheat. Because if we have this acidic root system in a high calcareous soil, anything that you break that phosphate bond, and if that phosphate sits there for any period of time, it's going to get reabsorbed by that calcium if it isn't being taken up by the plant. So, to have it in, absolutely. To have too much, yeah, I would, but especially for horses, keep it away from horses. There's some sensitivity issues with horses and buckwheat.
you have any grazing strategies to help increase the longevity of sandfoin? It hasn't lasted very long out here, and I know that they're saying to let it go to seed every so often, but how would you incorporate that into a grazing strategy?
Yeah, it's funny because when we go through and we're talking about sandfoin, it's great, but it doesn't last long. On our farm, we were haying it, we were doing some seed production on it, and we had to stand in there for 15 years. So longevity, yeah, it can. And people say, well, yeah, you were haying it, so this way you had some seed shatter out, and yeah, okay, I'll give you that. But it's the biggest thing is this back fence. And so when we're grazing, being able to control the animals from stop taking that second bite is crucial for whether you look at orchard grass, you look at sandfoin, you look at some of the more, in quotes, delicate species, being able to allow that plant to regrow and get to the point where, okay, it put enough reserves back into the root. This is how we make those fragile is the wrong word, but that's most people look at them as very fragile plants, but they're very powerful. And so especially when we start taking a look at the secondary plant metabolites in those, they're so important to have in our mixes and our blends. So for some people, it's taking 10% of their pasture, putting a fence around it, and excluding them all for 1 year. That's maybe a strategy to go in and to broadcast more or put into the mineral. All these are opportunities, but the biggest thing is this back fence to allow that plant to fully recover, because the animals, going back to that pasture walk we did at St. Brew, the animals were searching out for the higher sugar content of plants. And in this case, that was the orchard grass. And so when you have brome grass that's 2 feet high and you have orchard grass that's 1 foot high, you can't tell me that the orchard grass was always shorter than the brome. They were probably the same height, but the animals can detect up to a 0.1 change in Brix in plants, and they're going to eat the highest Brix level they can. And to put this in perspective, it's if you went to the grocery store, and we've all done it, where we bought a container of strawberries, unless you're allergic to strawberries. You have the strawberries and you eat it, and it's like eating cardboard. There's no taste to it. The next batch you go and you pick it up, and they're so sweet and they're so flavorful. And if you go and you take your Brix level of that tasteless one and that really tasty one, it's a huge difference in your Brix levels. And so what we're always trying to do is promote higher sugar content in our food, both for the animals and for ourselves.
Okay. We have some pasture that the ground is sandy. What cover crops are more resilient to this type of soil?
Okay, so one of the questions I always ask is, okay, so it's sandy, but where's the water table? Are you dealing with a high water table or a low water table? Because that's going to influence what we can do. Because on our farm, I had playground sand. Across the road was a gravel pit, so I had the sand, and I could grow corn, the tap-rooted species like alfalfa, the tap-rooted cover crops. I could grow that wonderful. I can produce, well, I was producing about 18 ton of corn with holistically no fertilizer, because the water table is high. So if it's high, getting those tap roots down there is once again crucial. To go in biennials are the next step. When we have a plant that is able to establish and get the roots down into that water table in the fall, and then in the spring, as the topsoil dries out, it's already down into the water. That's a win. when we have, and this is what we found with chicory the last few years. Chicory is a biennial forb, and it has this huge taproot that goes down. And when you ever find, if you're growing chicory or you have grown chicory in the past, if you've ever dug up a root, the roots are always wet. The soil around it is always wet. So it's a really high root exudate type of plant, and it's highly mycorrhizal. So there was a study in, I think, Ohio State. They had a huge tub of a soil profile, basically, of in the lab, and they were growing chickpeas and they're growing wheat together. And in the one tank of soil, they had a barrier that went in between the wheat and the chickpeas, and the other one didn't. And what they did is they induced drought stress on each one of the tanks. And what they found was where the chickpeas were growing without the barrier between it and the wheat survived. Where they had the barrier, the wheat died. And what was happening is the chickpeas, in this case, deep taproot, got into the water, stayed in the water, brought the water up, and through mycorrhizae shared that water over with the wheat plant. How's that for goofy? Where the barrier was, the mycorrhizae couldn't get through it, and the mycorrhizae couldn't link up that legume with that grass. So then the grass died. So when we have sandy soils, we want to use these biennial crops. So this is, once again, sweet clover, wonderful crop to use in sand. Chicory, beautiful. Then to have some of these shallower rooted species. So, is it going to be oats? Is it going to be, Japanese millet? Is it Italian rag? There's some options that we can be getting in there of the grass species. But basically, we want to make sure we have a good component of deep tap roots in there, especially of these biennials. So that's a strategy that I would look at.
I think with the year of drought, a lot of people are looking for pasture rejuvenation, and some of that is done by the mineral feed tubs. What species work best with feeding through the mineral?
Okay, so putting through mineral. So the biggest thing we want to look at are chaffy grasses and legumes with a high hull content. So anything that is, a finer type of grass seed with a finer hull probably isn't going to survive going through the rumen or the salt in with the mineral. But when we start dealing with sandfoin, for instance, if you take a look at the seed and then you take the hull off, that seed is quite a bit smaller than what that hull is. So this way you have more protection of that going through the rumen. So I'd say the bigger the seed, the more hull, those type of species are going to be the ones you want to look at. So the chaffier grasses and, will hairy vetch work? Hairy vetch, Sicer milk vetch. Sicer milk vetch naturally has a high hard seed count, which means that the seed is hard, so it doesn't absorb moisture very easily. So if it doesn't absorb moisture, so it's going to be hard when it goes through the rumen. Once again, it's not going to be digested, so most likely it's going to be pooped out and it's going to be sitting in a cow patty, so it'll have a better chance of germinating. So those would be kind of the three criteria that I would look at. So the big chaffy grasses, so your bromes, intermediate wheatgrass, going into sandfoin, going into Sicer milk vetch. And make sure that if you do use alfalfa or clovers, make sure you do not use inoculant, because that's going to mess up the rumen microbes. And no fungicide. that one too.
Well, I think that's come to the end of the questions. So I think you got off easy tonight. So I want to thank you again for joining us. And if anybody wants to get a hold of Kevin after this, you can definitely contact myself. I have all his information, or refer back. This will be posted to YouTube, so you guys can rewatch it if you want. Other than that, please just enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And thanks, Skelly, for inviting me. This is a wonderful night.